Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, Armin Afayan.
It's the best walk-in music I've ever gotten. I don't know about you, but I feel pretty good. So, my name's Armin Afayan. I lead the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative. I do that with an incredible assortment of dedicated humanitarians, activists, educators, many of whom are in this room. I had the pleasure of being with our board this morning. You're going to hear from several members of our selection committee over the coming days. We have our brilliant staff, our team, and of course, so many in this room are Aurora humanitarians for whom all of this exists. It's my absolute privilege to welcome you to the beautiful UCLA campus and kick off the very first Aurora Humanitarian Summit. Now, two of those words are probably pretty clear, hopefully to this group: humanitarian, certainly, and summit, a gathering. Aurora might raise questions. Many in this room have been nominated for the Aurora Prize, so that might help shed a light on what this is, but I'm aware that many in this room are coming in from other parts of the city, of the country, of the world, with little to no awareness of Aurora, so let's remedy that to start. Aurora is an organization that amplifies the stories and impact of incredible humanitarians around the world. The main way that we've done that for the last 10 years is through a $1 million prize that goes to a humanitarian who has risked their own lives to save others. They receive part of the prize fund themselves as an award, as the term prize implies, but the rest they actually share with other remarkable humanitarians in their communities and beyond, continuing the cycle of giving and uplifting humanitarians as exactly what they are, what you are, the very best of humanity. This here right now is an important occasion, arguably 10 years in the making. When our co-founders, the late Vartan Gregorian, Ruben Vardanyan, and Nubar Afayan, came together 10 years ago, they did that in the spirit of putting gratitude into action. Descendants of survivors of the Armenian genocide, they decided to commemorate the centennial of that atrocity, 10 years ago for 100 years before that, by focusing not only on the traditional narrative that surrounds genocides, Holocaust atrocities of perpetrators and victims, but rather by focusing their attention on the survivors and their saviors. Each felt deep gratitude for the courageous actions of strangers who intervened to save their ancestors. They decided to act on that gratitude by jointly establishing the Aurora Prize to honor, to celebrate those, including many in this room, who risked their own lives the same way today, such that others in another room 100 years from now, or even just 5 days from now, may stand together in solidarity and celebrate the lives that they've been able to live as a result. But I want to pause for a moment to talk about where we are right now, because this is a pretty remarkable room. In this room, we have Aurora humanitarians from 5 continents, humanitarians and activists based right here in LA, fellow practitioners and experts from many, many places in between. In this room, we have doers of all sorts. We have educators, medical professionals, advocates, counselors, leaders, and so many more. In this room, ultimately, we have the best of the best. The other room, I'm kidding, obviously. People who choose to live their days in pursuit of a better world. One act of courage and one act of kindness at a time. For my part, there is no better room to be in. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank every single person, whether you traveled long or far, in distance or in any other way. On behalf of the Aurora team, thank you for being here with us. Finally, a note of thanks to those in particular without whom this room wouldn't exist. I want to offer my sincere thanks to our sponsors for today's activities and tomorrow's. First, the Purpleville Foundation. We have many representatives here in the room and many others who are a part of their community. Thank you. And also to Goodwin Procter, to the Schumann Family Foundation, and of course, to UCLA, the Promise Institute, the law school, and the Israeli family for welcoming us into their academic home. Again, thank you all for joining us in Awakening Humanity this week. When we gather, we create in a room, wherever it is in the world, for however much time we have together, the very world that we want to see outside. Again, one in which humanitarianism and humanitarians are upheld as exactly what you are, the very best of humanity. And we are eager and humble and curious to learn and to listen. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Aurora's Colin Thomas-Jensen, who will introduce and moderate our opening panel. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Armin, for your leadership. It's not difficult right now to look at the state of the world. Conflicts spreading, authoritarianism rising in many places, transnational disruptions like climate change and the coming AI revolution affecting the way that we live our lives. And it's not hard to feel a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness in the face of, I think, will be generation-defining challenges. So to open this summit, as we look out on a world of great challenges, I have on the stage 4 extraordinary women whose activism, bravery, and leadership are a testament to the power of one individual to affect change. I'd like to introduce them one by one, and then we'll get into the panel. First, Leymah Gbowee is a 2011 Nobel Peace Laureate and a Liberian peace activist, a trained social worker and women's rights advocate. She's the founder and current president of Gbowee Peace Foundation Africa. She also serves as the executive director of the Women, Peace, and Security Program at Columbia University's Earth Institute in New York. And she's the co-founder and executive director of the Women, Peace, and Security Network Africa, and a founding member, and former Liberia coordinator of Women in Peace Building Network. Alice Greenwald is a board member of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative and the founder and principal of Memory Matters, an organization which provides guidance to communities and organizations seeking to document mass casualty events and to commemorate the victims. She served as president and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum from 2017 to 2022, and as the founding director of the 9/11 Memorial Museum from 2006 to 2016. And prior to that, she was the associate museum director at the U.S. Holocaust and Memorial Museum, overseeing museum programs including exhibitions, education, collections, the library, and the many museum services. Sunitha Krishnan is a 2018 Aurora Humanitarian, and she's the co-founder of an organization called Prajwala in India. She's a survivor of sexual violence and a women's rights advocate. She's used the trauma inflicted upon her as motivation to rescue, rehabilitate, and reintegrate victims of sex trafficking and forced prostitution back into society. And finally, at the end, is Dulce Valencia. She's a multidisciplinary artist from Guerrero, Mexico, based here in LA. She has a deep-rooted and personal passion for immigrant rights. I'm sure you understand why. And she's dedicated a significant portion of her career to advocating for comprehensive immigration reform and empowering civic participation through her work in political nonprofits. Thank you all for being here. With this truly international panel, I'm going to start with our representative from Liberia to my right here. And my question is, Liberians experienced one of the world's most devastating conflicts from 1989 to 1997, only to see that civil war resume again in 1999. Would you please help us understand what drove you to organize Liberian women of all backgrounds, Muslim and Christian, urban and rural, in a nonviolent peace effort in your country?
Thank you, Colin. Just one quick correction. On my bio, I left Columbia. I'm now at the City University Law School, where we have an institute.
Noted.
So the war started when I was 17, one day after my high school graduation. And it progressed until I was probably in my late 20s when I started, but I was very angry. I was angry. All 17-year-olds are angry, but mine was at another level because we grew up in a bubble, and that bubble was a sense of community. I grew up in a space where we had Christian, Muslim, about 10 of Liberia's 16 ethnic groups. We really didn't know whose father didn't work because food was shared. If there was funeral, everyone contributed. So really a sense of community, and then all of a sudden you hear you can't interact with this person and that person. So I carried that for a long time. But I think like the moment we find ourselves in, when we started our nonviolent movement, it was like our backs were against the wall. You either succumb to all of what people were doing or you fight back. And one of the things that we knew we had to fight back for was the definition or the narrative that was being created that we're divisive people. We didn't like Muslims or Christians. We didn't like ourselves and all of the different things. So we decided, let's just do something. And when we started this movement, I tell people that, especially in this, again, coming back to the movement, people think that, oh, you need millions of dollars to start something significant. We sat on a desk that had no leg. It was propped on a brick, and there were bullet holes all in that desk. And we were sitting there and writing. But I think one of the things that gave us traction was everyone was afraid to name themselves. And when we said, first, let's issue a statement. And the statement we're issuing was to say 3 things that the government at the time said they won't do: immediate unconditional ceasefire, dialogue between the warring parties, and the deployment of an intervention force. And then we wrote this statement, and someone said, let's say the women of Liberia. My response was, this is disingenuous. 7 people cannot represent the women of Liberia. So let's name ourselves. And we wrote our names. That was the beginning of everything, because everyone wanted to know who these 7 fools were in the midst of tyranny to name themselves. But I think when you live in a space, and to answer your question, you live in a space where people find creative ways to rain havoc on other people's lives, it becomes necessary. So for us, starting that movement was necessary because of the times that we live in. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Alice, you've dedicated yourself to educating people about traumatic events in the past, like the traumatic events that Leymah and her country, men and women, experienced in Liberia. How they happened, why they happened, their devastating human impact, and how understanding this history and learning from it can help us prevent similar horrors from happening again. For very different reasons, the Holocaust and 9/11 are difficult topics on which to engage an audience, and we'd love to hear your considerations as you think about telling stories like this.
Thank you, Colin, and let me just first say how privileged I feel to be sitting with these women, and with Colin, of course, but they are doing God's work, and I really am honored. So, you know, in both cases, the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum in DC and the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, we had a guiding principle, which was that it was essential for our visitors to see themselves in the stories we told. And I'll give you the perfect example of what I mean by that. So at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, there's a historical exhibit, there's a memorial exhibit. And in the memorial exhibition, the gallery is shaped just like the memorial pools above, a square within a square. And on the outer square, on the walls, floor to ceiling, all around the room, are portraits and names of the nearly 3,000 people killed during the 9/11 attacks. They are 2.5 to 85 years old. They are from over 90 nations. They represent every ethnicity imaginable, every faith tradition, every sector of the economy. So you're looking at a microcosm, literally, of the world. And you walk in, and you immediately look at these faces and names, and you are struck by the fact that this could have been me. This could have been a member of my family. This could have been a colleague. These people are people just like me. And that's when the tragedy is not somebody else's problem. That's when it becomes your problem. You then move into a center space, we call it the inner chamber, where people who knew the victims, not a curator reading a biography in the New York Times and then telling you about that person, third person distance, but people who knew and loved them, their family members, their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues, their soccer coaches, whatever. They had a personal relationship. And the stories they tell about the victims are the stories that all of us tell when we get together for family gatherings. They are funny, sometimes they're off color, sometimes they are just, extraordinarily moving, but they're stories that are familiar to all of us. And they're stories that celebrate lives lived, not how people died. So again, you sit there and you think, this is about people like me. So in the context of these museums, there was this element of generating, teaching empathy. And the most effective way to teach empathy is by telling stories. So the original director of the Holocaust Museum, Sheike Weinberg, came up with this phrase. This is back in the early 1990s. It was very novel then, and he referred to the museum as a storytelling museum. And Sheike actually came out of the world of theater. We were just talking about theater. And he had been the director of the Municipal Theater in Tel Aviv. And as a theater director, he understood not only narrative structure, he understood audience, and he understood that what theater does is something very special. And he analogized that to museums. Okay, so if you think about it, in a theater, you're sitting in your seats, the actors are moving on the stage. In a museum, the artifacts, the displays are stationary, and you move through them. But the narrative arc, the pathway, is the same as in theater. And where you end up is a place where a colleague of mine used the phrase, in order to get to the head, you have to crack open the heart. In order to get to the head, you have to crack open the heart. So I am in the business of cracking open people's hearts in these memorial museums, which are dedicated to what all museums are dedicated to, which is figuring out who we are as human beings. That's what museums are about. What does it mean to be human? In a natural history museum, what does it mean to be a human in relation to the natural world? In a memorial museum, the question gets turned slightly. And it is, what does it mean to be a human being when people are capable of this level of evil that results in mass murder? What is that part of our humanity? So they are cautionary tales. They are places where we see the worst of who we can be. But there's also a twist there, because the reason we have to look into the mirror of the worst of ourselves is that it actually unlocks our potential for our capacity for compassion and justice. And so on the other side of what happens in these two museums is that our stories are about people who stand up in the face of the worst of our human nature. And those stories are throughout both museums. The Polish farm lady who takes in a Jewish child, puts that child in a cupboard to protect them at risk of her own family's safety. And when you ask that woman, as she was, why did you do that? She looks at you like you're crazy and says, that's what human beings do. Or the story of Wells Crowther, a young man, a bond trader in the South Tower, Tower 2 at the World Trade Center, who is known as the man in the red bandana, because on the day of 9/11, he happened to, unfortunately, be on the impact floor of Flight 175 as it crashed into the 67th floor. And he was a volunteer EMT. He had always carried a little red handkerchief in his pocket. He puts it on his face to prevent smoke inhalation, and he proceeds to tend to the needs of 18 injured people who he brings down 67, 68 flights of stairs, goes back up, brings another one down, and he did not himself survive. He was killed in the collapse of that tower. But when word got out that these people were talking about the man in the red bandana, they didn't know his name, complete stranger, saved their lives, his parents go, that had to be Wells, because he always had the red bandana. That story is the story President Obama chose to share at the dedication of the 9/11 memorial. So this is work about stories that help us understand who we are, what we are capable of, good and bad, but that ultimately helps us take the anonymity away from mass murder and put a face and a name to the victims so that we can recognize ourselves in their stories. And by doing that, mobilize, activate moral conscience that's rooted in empathy. That's really what the work is.
Thank you. Sunitha,
Balancing myself.
I'm leaning forward so I can see down the line. You've spent your entire adult life combating sex trafficking, and that's obviously one of the most difficult and emotional, and for you, very deeply personal global challenges that we face. You yourself are a survivor of a horrendous act of sexual violence. As you think about the work that you've done in India and around the world in the face of the immense challenges, and we'll get later on to how much more complicated those challenges are today than they were when you started this work, how have you managed to maintain a sense of hope in the face of what are often, I think, overwhelming odds?
Colin, I was gang raped when I was 15. That is 35 years back. In the last 35 years, I have seen the bleakness, the hopelessness, and the helplessness across the world only increase. Rape being used as a weapon of war, more and more marginalized, vulnerable group of women and children being taken as sex slaves through sex trafficking. Some of the most horrendous part of my work has been to see the lowering of age. The youngest child that I have rescued from a brothel is 3 years old. And today when I see the content available virtually of child sexually abusive material, I see even a 6-month baby being sexually exploited for commercial purposes. So that is a world of bleakness that I see. And that bleakness is, simultaneously, there's another thing that is happening across the world where the society chooses silence, the society chooses normalization, and there are governments across the globe, India no exception, which creates optics of hoodwinking everybody around, but generally normalizing, sex slavery as a norm, In that kind of a situation, what gives me hope is 2 things. One are the victims and survivors themselves. I have removed more than 32,000 of them from different spaces of commercial sexual exploitation. And what fills me with awe is their amazing generosity of the spirit to forgive, to believe in human compassion, to believe in human trust, to believe in a life with dignity out of exploitation. I think it's an unimaginable kind of a miracle for a person who has seen the worst of humanity, has been subjected to bestiality that we cannot even imagine. Just imagine being raped 20 times a day by various buyers, getting cigarette butts all over your body, getting bladed all over, and yet you believe and trust another human being. That fills me with hope and energy. The second thing that fills me with hope and energy is the small segment of humanity which is awakened or have awoken from their slumber, who continue their efforts in spite of, very adversarial forces pulling them back. And I think this Aurora family is one small, example of that segment of humanity which believes in hope, which is upholding human compassion. And somebody like me comes here to take that energy and that hope, which is going to, it's kind of a rejuvenation kind of space. So I think we are the hope, and I think the human beings that I serve every day fill me with hope and the possibility that things can change. When I see them, I know we can change anything.
Beautifully said. Dulce, you are a powerful and, dare I say, relentless voice in the fight to shift immigration narratives. And a lot of what we're talking about on stage today is storytelling and how to tell a story in a way that reaches people in the most human way. Right now, we're seeing a rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric, policies, and media messaging that are not only harmful but deeply dehumanizing. Rather than isolated government actions, we're witnessing a broader cultural campaign, one that frames immigrants as threats instead of neighbors, contributors, and community members. And I'll just say as an aside, I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., and just today in D.C., there were a number of ICE raids on schools and businesses, and I got a text message from a parent group at my school asking other parents to come to the school and stand in front to prevent ICE agents from entering. So this is a very real, and for me today, very personal issue. How are these harmful narratives and the culture of fear that they perpetuate impacting your work? And in a moment when the attacks are both personal and systemic, how are you choosing where to focus your energy as an activist?
Thank you so much for your question, and I would just want to thank Aurora for bringing us all together. I feel incredibly honored to be among these incredible women. At Define American, we believe that politics are downstream from culture, and that we cannot change the politics of immigration until we first change the culture through which immigrants are seen. So the work we're doing really is working within that culture to shift narratives. So yes, there's no denying the headlines that we're seeing, they're deeply dehumanizing, that are focused on just one area of immigration. They're meant to lump immigrants together and make us believe one thing, that they're criminals, that they are threats to this country. And so the work we've been doing is working with storytellers to combat these narratives, because throughout our work, we've been able to study how narratives can shift perceptions. So we've done a lot of work within Hollywood, consulting on over 130 different projects across different networks, both in TV and film. And we've been able to study the impact of authentic immigrant representation on TV, and have found that audiences can shift their perspective on immigrants based on the content that they consume. So this is due in part to something known as parasocial contact theory, which is when audiences create a parasocial or imagined friendship with the characters that they are seeing. So for example, think of any TV show that you've watched recently. For me, I was really into season 3 of White Lotus. So I was watching this show, and I cared so much about what happened to Chelsea and Rick and what was going to happen at the end. And I'm sure you all have a show in mind that you can think of, or a movie that you watched where it felt like it was real, it felt like it was your friend or your family member. So we were actually able to study this on a show we consulted on called Superstore. There was a character named Mateo who was actually one of the first undocumented immigrant characters ever on TV. And we were able to work with the showrunners and the writers to create this character. And so audiences got to know this character of Mateo, who is kind of annoying. He's kind of, like really a rule follower, and he kind of causes problems for people, but he felt real. He felt like someone you knew. And over the course of various episodes and seasons, we then come to find out that Mateo is not only an immigrant, but he's undocumented. And so the storyline lasted various seasons up until the end. And we do every 2 years research with USC's Norman Lear Center, and we studied that audience's view of that character and that storyline, and we were able to find that audiences shifted. So people who previously had a negative opinion of immigrants or thought that immigrants were all criminals or just were not accustomed to seeing immigrants in real life shifted their perception. So we know that seeing people, especially in communities that are not exposed to immigrants, they are able to learn and they're able to shift their perspectives. And it's because culture is able to break through the chatter of headlines. So a TV show is gonna move audiences in a different way than a PSA telling you all these statistics of what immigrants are. We need those statistics, but sometimes it tunes people out and they're not paying attention. But if you're watching a show, laughing, having fun, and then you learn something new. You learn that immigrants sometimes come to this country and don't realize they're undocumented until later on, something that happens in the show like Superstore. And then we're also doing work within influencers. So last year with Tides Foundation, we were able to partner 10 nonprofit immigrant organizations with 10 influencers to create content that was meant to combat anti-immigrant rhetoric, specifically online. And we were able to study the results of these videos and found that these videos were shifting people and getting them off the trajectory of the algorithm, which if you watch something that shows you a certain view or perception of immigrants, you're more likely to keep seeing that content. And so we found that, for example, there's this video where we have an influencer bring her parents, who are immigrants from Korea, and bring them and meet Salvadorian immigrants. And even though they don't speak the same language, they're not from the same culture, they were able to bond over food. And food in particular, we found shifts people and shifts narratives. And it's because we're leading with culture, we're leading with stories, we're leading with human beings. And so in this era that we find ourselves in of anti-immigrant rhetoric and hate, this is incredibly personal to me as someone who was undocumented for many, many years and only recently became a green card holder. This work is personal. I feel it every day, and it's really difficult to stay away from the headlines and to choose joy in this context. And that's how I'm actually working to combat the headlines, is choosing joy, radical joy, because to choose joy at a time like this is resisting, and it is showing that, this is our home. We do make this country better. We are within the fabric of the foundation of this country that is also ours. And so I'm choosing joy in this moment, and I'm choosing to center on the humanity.
Thank you. I love the idea of radical joy. I'm going to have to incorporate that into my daily life here. Leymah, back to you. Fortunately, due to your work and the work of so many others, Liberia has found some measure of stability now. We were talking just before, and you said, it's home, right? It's become a place that we can visit now and not have to worry about war. But the kinds of atrocities that Liberians experienced during that civil war are sadly ongoing, still in many places of the world. Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Syria, just to name a few. Based on your experiences in Liberia, and for anyone who has followed the conflict, it really was one of the most brutal conflicts in human history, and particularly the use of child soldiers. How, based on your experiences, or what advice, based on your experiences, do you have for our assembled humanitarians here, some of them from places like the DRC and Sudan? What advice do you have for them when they're working in places that are experiencing or threatened by conflict?
Thank you, Colin. You know, most times we tend to want to follow what the donors want. Because money, let's be realistic, money is a big thing in humanitarian work. One of the things that my experience in all of these years is that I follow what my community needs. When we started our movement, I remember going to one donor to ask to fund our work. And he said to me, those were the days that I was young, I was a firebrand, I could say anything, and the word was there for me to take. The soldiers, like literally, I was a militia in my own right. And so I go to this person and we talk, and the first thing he does is to offer me a job. That you're smart, like in the midst of the war, I'm not working, everything we're doing is volunteering, I have young children. He said to me, I'll pay you $1,500, we'll fly you to the US, but we want you as our justice and peace coordinator. And I said to him, sir, I came to ask for money for my movement. I didn't come to look for a job. And then he said, unfortunately, I can't give you any money for this protest because it is like a subversive thing. It is against democracy. He made all kinds of excuses. But out of the goodness of my heart, I will contribute $100 to your movement. Maybe it was to insult me, but I was so happy because that $100 for a struggling movement looked like $1 million. And I told him, thank you, and went skipping out of his office. The second thing that I would say, so own your process. Don't, for all of us working in these war zones, in these areas, own your process. No one can come into your space and tell you how to navigate your space better than yourself. That's the first thing. The second thing that I would say is that as you own your process, you also have to be very firm about you will go head to head with the powers that be. I'll give another quick story. When it was time for disarmament in Liberia, that was 2003, December, the UN way of doing the disarmament was to fly the private planes, the UN planes, over communities and drop flyers. These are people who cannot read. So you're dropping flyers to say this is what the soldiers should do. On the day of disarmament, we show up, and it wasn't disarmament as disarmament, it was symbolic disarmament. So they had prepared for 1,000 fighters. More than 5,000 fighters show up. All of them came brandishing different kinds of weapons. They did not know what to do. We brought in 25 young men to disarm them for their community, and we stood there, shooting started. The next morning, we went to the warlords, sat with them, then we went to the UN, and we made a statement on everything they had done wrong. And this US general who had come as the head of the UN, everyone who went to him now and said, oh, so what do we do? He said, go to Leymah, she has the answer. But the way we had that answer to that question was, we wanted to be in charge. We were now determining to them that we want to be in charge of the education and the awareness on how the process will unfold. And at the end of the day, we were able, because what we saw on that day, and this is something to say to the humanitarians, if you do not own your process, if it goes haywire, the international organizations will be airlifted and evacuated out of your space. You will remain there. And that Sunday, when everything went haywire, people were airlifted, and we were left with the boys trying to calm them to not do the shooting. The final thing that I would like to say, especially to those in this room who feel like I'm a donor and I need to know what happens to my money, I think it's very important for people to allow local communities and local organizations to determine the path that they want to be on. I will end with this crazy story that happened in Liberia during the war. This group went to a community where the women used to walk 30 minutes to fetch water to go, 30 minutes to come back. And they came and did their assessment. And the only thing they determined was that these women needed a hand pump. So without consultation, without consulting the community, they put a huge hand pump in the middle of the community. So then they had saved these women from walking 30 minutes to go, 30 minutes to come. In this room, in the Western world, in your minds, it's like, yes, they've done a good thing. 2 months down the road, alcoholism increased amongst the women. The children were not being taken care of. They were not doing their work properly. So another group went back into the community to say, let's sit with these women and ask, what is going on? And the response was this. When we walked to the stream, we told all of our stories about the abuses, the hardship. So that was our trauma healing. By the time we were coming back, we had solutions for our mental health problem. So when you came and you put a pump in the middle of the community, we have no outlet for anything now. So the easy way to do is to abuse alcohol, because then the alcohol is helping us to forget our story. So I say this to say to all of us doing the work, the donors will go. It is your space. Plant your feet firmly and say, this is what I'm doing. That's the first thing. Know your fish and chips. Don't jump from left, right, and center and say, this donor come and say, I'm giving 1 million for HIV, you jump there. I'm giving 20,000 for this, you jump there. Let everyone know you for what you're doing. Let your community know you. Let your expertise speak for you. And I think that is the advice I would give to people.
Thank you. I jotted down as you were telling that last story, the detritus of donor good intentions is scattered across many countries, if you've spent time in developing countries. You talked a bit about funding, and before I turn to you, Alice, I wanted to just cite some statistics, as I know we're all aware of the crisis in funding for humanitarian assistance and development. The evisceration of USAID being the primary example, but many other countries are following suit. The UN has done some polling on this, and so far it's not looking good for local organizations. 75% of national or local organizations found that they had cuts based on what's happened over the last several months. 75% of organizations receiving U.S. support to do protection and gender-based violence work have been cut. And 80% of women or refugee-led humanitarian organizations have also faced cuts. We've talked a lot about storytelling, and Alice, I wonder if someone that you have your finger on the pulse of philanthropy at a time when global humanitarian needs are increasing and donor government resources are diminishing. What advice do you have for our local humanitarians assembled here on how they can use their incredible personal stories to keep attention and, most importantly, funding on the work that they're doing?
So that's a big question. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I have an answer, because this is really, it's a seismic shift. It's a sobering moment. Programs that really were doing so much good in the world have been undercut and dismantled, which is devastating. It's devastating for the people who were doing the work. It's even more devastating for the recipients of the aid. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I will be. And that is that I think there is even greater urgency for you to share your stories on every available platform, to let people know what it is you do, why you do it, how you do it, that at the very local level, you know what the needs are, and you are addressing them. In effect, I'm asking you to continue to crack people's hearts open so we can change minds. And in that respect, everyone in this room is like a mini memorial museum out there in the world, conveying the reality on the ground and the fact that we are not impotent because there are people like you in the world. who can make a difference. And if we're going to see ourselves in the story, the gift you give to the rest of us is to remind us that we also have the capacity to make change in the world and to address the issues in front of us. And I just want to, I told Colin I wanted to read something because a friend of mine sent me a quote the other day, and it struck me so powerfully in the context of this gathering, and particularly because it felt like it was a manifesto for Aurora. And I'm just going to read it right now, if you don't mind. It won't take very long. But it was written in 2004 by a political science professor at Boston University named Howard Zinn. And it was in an article called The Optimism of Uncertainty. And he wrote, and this speaks directly to what Sunitha just said to us, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, that is itself a marvelous victory."
Thank you. Sunitha, you alluded to it before, the challenges that you're facing that you didn't face 35 years ago, but I'll mention them. Widespread use of the internet and connectivity across borders, social media platforms that essentially pump often the worst content toward people who are viewing that, AI-generated images and videos, deep fakes, all tools that have now become commonplace in threatening the safety of women. Also, the increasing sophistication of organized crime networks, which you've talked about, that have really made the global trafficking crisis much worse than I think anyone could have anticipated. What changes have you seen, and how are you adapting to these challenges? And what are 2 or 3 things that governments and the private sector can do to help mitigate the impact of the things I just mentioned?
Colin, just last year we did a national study on how cyber technology is enabling human trafficking. And some of the findings were astonishing. Practically all the platforms, surface web, has been taken over by the organized criminal mafia. There's social media, instant messaging apps, job sites, matrimonial sites, dating sites, you name it, they are all spread over there. Another aspect that has come out of our study, and of course, post-pandemic, it has been seen more and more, is the increasing number of children being exploited through technology. And what is worrisome is, while the victim is somebody that you can see, you can feel the pain, the destruction that the victim has been subjected to, the perpetrator is practically invisible. And technology provides for that. Technology provides for more and more clandestine spaces, fake profiles, encryption, and all kinds of things. I don't think in the history of humankind we have seen as much content of sexual exploitation, which is now kind of a irreversible content which cannot be destroyed, available, from infant babies to any age, any nationality, and all of it is technologically enabled. And what is worrying for somebody like me is kind of a dead-end situation in terms of closure for a victim. A victim who's exploited using technology is also, inevitably bringing out some permanent content. That content can be used against this person for a lifetime because that content cannot be destroyed. It can be saved in a pen drive or a hard disk, or it can be kept in some other place. So that is the kind of situation that technology is enabling. And for us, two things come out for what can be done. At one end, the physical borders, the territories, and everything is what wars are going on. But the governments need to understand virtual space is a borderless space. And it's high time that the global community come together as one whole and decide on some kind of a convention, protocol that governs the entire globe. Because this is a borderless space, and we need cooperation for prevention, we need cooperation for intelligence gathering, we need cooperation for investigation, we need cooperation for prosecution. It is now or never. That's how fast technology is moving. But at the same time, there is another part that we need to consider. Technology is a man-made stuff. It is created by technological firms. I'm not saying all the technological firms are rogues. There are good ones who take their own responsibility, like Google and other places, who say, okay, we have a responsibility. Then there are others like Meta who have to be pushed under duress, but they still do because they want a public face. And there are rogue companies like Telegram who don't care a damn. I mean, they can do anything and get away with anything. So I think it's high time the global community, we are the consumers. Let us remember that. And as Leymah said, we need to own our process. And we need to own the space that we are consumers. And as consumers, we need to start demanding for accountability of technological firms. They need to be acknowledged and to be accountable for their platforms. What is the safeguarding protocols there? How much does it minimize the organized mafia taking over? Do they do that? Or is it just business standards? It's high time we as a community and global community start demanding that safety of humanity is ethical business practice, and that all technological firms need to follow it. And only then they can do business in any country, whether it's in the United States or India. And that's the kind of measures that needs to be taken on a war footing. The way we are going, and I feel sometimes, the price we have to pay for our silence and for our normalization of tolerating crime is going to be huge. And it's now that we need to awaken. And now, it's very important that each one of us take a decision that we will not think in silos. We need to come together and we need to become a one collective voice with our governments, with all the technology that we are consuming.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I'm gonna throw one more question out. And Dulce said, invite you to take the first crack at it, but anyone please answer. This talk about storytelling has gotten me thinking about the kinds of systems that we're living in now, where in this country, I think you could say, for news, we're living in a bifurcated system. There are different ecosystems, depending on what your politics are, where you get your news, and the stories that you hear very much depend on what you watch, what you listen to, and the choices you make are often based on politics. You have other countries where you're living really in a closed system, where you could grow up in China and have no idea that Tiananmen Square ever happened. And you probably might never learn that unless you actively seek it out. So how, when you have systems that are sort of built to be self-reinforcing, and are often in either in competition with one another in a storytelling setting, or there's simply no competition, and one group gets to set the narrative. How do you think about storytelling and breaking through to the people that we're trying to reach, to find that common humanity when there's a system that's in place designed to tell a story that's unique to the government or whoever's in control of that place?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm gonna answer this as it relates to specifically storytellers and working within film and TV, but I think it applies to anyone and their own personal story. Something that I always advocate at Define American within our consulting work is the importance of specificity. So within that is making sure that when you're telling your story, you're being as specific as possible. And I know it can seem a little contradictory to be so specific to your own story. How is that ever going to relate to anyone? But what we found is time and time again, it's those specific stories that resonate universally. And so it's so important to lean into the power of your own story and to make sure that you're honoring that. Our founder always likes to say, there's 48 million immigrants living in the United States. That's 48 million stories and different ways of being an immigrant. So no one story is ever going to capture all of that, nor should it, but it's by adding more and more stories to the ecosystem that we can then try to get to universality. And so I also want to say that there's a lot of challenges within this, specifically within film and TV and even publishing across media, is that shows that tend to be more diverse or tend to focus on marginalized voices are constantly being canceled, or they're not being given a fair shot to find an audience. So I always like to bring a show like Parks and Recreation or The Office even, that are majorly popular shows, but that struggled for their first 3 seasons to find an audience. Then we have shows like Gordita Chronicles, which was about a immigrant family coming to the United States and their life story. And it was critically acclaimed, it was popular with audiences, but it didn't hit exactly what HBO wanted, and it got canceled after the first season. So those are the challenges that we're facing. So oftentimes what we're being told and what people are being encouraged to do is, if you have a story to tell, you have to tell it yourself. And fortunately, we have access to social media, which can be a curse, but it can also be a tool to reach audiences far and wide. We found that YouTube, for example, is replacing traditional TV. More and more families are sitting down and actually watching YouTube on their TV versus their phone. So people using that knowledge can go ahead and create their own stuff, film things on their phone, and tell the story that they want to tell without waiting for the gatekeepers to say yes. So I really, really do encourage everyone to lean into the specificity of your own story. And if you have a story to tell, don't wait for someone to give you permission. Just go ahead and tell it yourself.
I like the fact that Dulce ended with, don't wait for anyone to give you permission, because at the start of the war in Liberia, if you watch CNN, read New York Times, all of the narrative about that war was about boys with guns and drugs and men with guns and the whole conversation about blood diamonds. No one ever captured the part where women were abused. At least 65% of the women population was sexually assaulted. No one captured the fact that, so it was almost like we were invisible. So the moment where we started our action, it was to change that narrative. It was to show to the world that, hey, here is the other group. We are not just silent victims, we are also party to this conflict. So by putting ourselves out there, and someone once asked, why do you think you being out there made a huge difference? Through actions, I think we're telling our story. Through actions, I think we're telling the world, pay attention here. And it was through those actions that people begin to pay attention to all of the things that were happening with the women. But the international community would send people, and there was absolutely no question about the voices of women, the impact, and all of the different things. So I think in those moments, or whenever you're faced with these kinds of things, it's either through action that you can tell your story, or you begin to tell your story verbally. But there was another point that you raised about money and USAID, and today, John and I had a conversation in there about it. One of the things that I would like to say is, whilst this is horrible, what has happened, I think there's also some good in it. Imagine a country like Liberia with 5 million people, and our government depended on USAID to give them $250,000, not millions, $250,000 to distribute drugs in the Leeward counties. We have iron ore. We have 43% of the forests in the Minor River Basin and, quote unquote, parts of West Africa. Why do we need the US government to give us that kind of money when we have government officials riding a $150,000 car? You have members of parliament riding. So I think in as much as this moment is bad, this is the moment for us, the humanitarians in our communities, to begin to raise our voices against some of the corruptions and some of the things, because some of the work that we're doing around all of the different things, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, is man-made because of massive corruption in our communities. That's why we have it. But finally, also, there are some, for those doing women's work, there are some feminist funds. And I know the word feminist have become very, very toxic in certain spaces in the world today, but there are some funds that are open to women. Women are stepping up and helping other women. So I think people need to just look around and see where fundings are for the work that we're doing. Unfortunately, I don't know about funds for men.
I
We're fine.
completely second that, because I think across the world, India, we see it so often, so many project-based organizations, you know, they have no mission. They have nothing they want to change. Where is the money? The grant proposal will be written. And when the money is cut off, so today it is HIV/AIDS, tomorrow it is water sanitation, day after tomorrow it's something else. And I think we need to kind of expose these kind of groups, because if we are bringing social transformation, then the society should be involved in the process of transformation. And there's enough resources on the ground for that. You know, if you see the amount of corruption in all our countries and the suitcases that go that way and that way, why are we depending on USAID for funding? And why are we all crying that it is cut off funds and so work gets thing? Why should it? You know, so I think we need to review and perhaps take a step back to see how we are financing and mobilizing for our movement, and whether our movement is a movement or it's some kind of a donor-driven agenda.
And I would just say, I agree with everything, and it's incredibly encouraging to hear a call from the other side that says, let us self-determine. We don't need to be dependent. Let us do it ourselves, and we just have to hope and pray that the right forces come together to make that happen. But Colin, your question is really about living in a post-truth world, and that's where we are. Truth is relative, which it should never be. And when that is the reality, what is demanded of us is that we have to document and document and document what we're actually living through and experiencing. And the analogy for me, I'm a historian, it comes from history, but in the Warsaw Ghetto, where Jews were being deported regularly to the death camps, there was an underground group that made it their mission to collect every piece of paper that was distributed in the ghetto, to document everything that was going on, all the rules, the regulations. And they wrote a history of what was going on, of what had happened to them, their families, their neighbors, what was going on. And that documentation was placed into 3 tin milk cans, and buried underground because they knew they were not going to survive. But they wanted this legacy of their experience, this testimony of what had happened to outlive them. And in fact, after the war, when the ghetto was razed, they did recover 2 of the 3 Melcans, and it became known as the Ringelblum Archive. It is the documentation that refutes the alternative narrative. And so it is incumbent to tell these stories, to act on what you experience, and to document what you know to be true, because that ultimately, I believe, where I find hope is believing that the truth will always eventually come out.
I think that's a great place to end. I'll just say a couple more quick words. Authenticity, I think, is so important in storytelling, and I think you have on stage here 4 extraordinarily authentic women telling their stories and offering us wisdom. We're about to move into our breakout sessions. We have a short break. We have coffee, refreshments outside. There's a map. It's a map that you can write your name, your organization, and then physically, and we'll have someone to show you, move a little post-it to where in the world you're working, because we'd like to get a snapshot of where everyone is coming from. And yeah, I want to thank our extraordinary panel for spending time with us, and look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.